This is Progress Canada, presented by Lightbulb Narrative. Today we're joined by Stephanie Smyth, MPP for the riding of Toronto-St. Paul's, and the Ontario Liberal Party's critic for ethics, integrity, and accountability.
Hey, it's great to be here. Nice to see you.
Okay, so we are coming to this conversation from the same riding, technically, because of course you are my new MPP, which is really exciting for me. I went from a double not liberal riding to a double liberal riding, so I'm pretty pleased about that and happy to have you on today.
Great.
Before we sort of get into the issues that we want to talk about today, I do want to talk about your past life in journalism before this, because you had a pretty lengthy career, both in terms of being on-air anchor, but also in terms of, being the news director for a number of different really, really big organizations in the province. So, just to list them off: 680 News, Global Television, CP24, really, really big ones that people are really well aware of. And in that time of doing that job, I have to suspect you got really, really good at spotting bullshit in government. And I suspect that lends you to some of the work you do now. But can you talk a little bit about your career as a journalist and how that sort of prepared you for this role you have now when you're looking, as the critic for the Liberal Party for ethics, integrity, and accountability?
This is what I love so much about podcasts. You can say words like, I still can't let it come out of my mouth, really, but I could never say that on the air.
If you want.
How many times, right? Do we want to say that? That is just a rock of. Going back to about 30 years in journalism, it just hurts me to say that, but it was an amazing career in that I was able to span broadcast journalism. So, from radio, as you mentioned, to television, most recently, the 16 years at CP24. And all through those years, yes, there is, several levels of government, several politicians, several elections that were held, and always, the accountability piece is there in that you're watching what's happening in government and you're doing your best to hold the government to account. So it was constantly, look, we are the voice of the people when you're a journalist, right? You're asking all those questions, you're holding government to account, you're following the money, it's taxpayer money. So much of that is so similar to what I'm doing now, right? So I feel like, in a sense, it's a continuation of that career.
Obviously in my time at Queen's Park, I worked with a number of different journalists, and you have different levels of comfort with them because, again, we are technically opposition forces when you're in government versus the journalists. But, I think at the end of the day, people who have any real respect for the journalistic process and the democratic process recognize that you're, obviously approaching these things with the same goals in mind. So for those who may not have the same goals in mind, I do want to talk about the Skills Development Fund and the Auditor General's recent report. So for our listeners who don't necessarily know about this issue, it has been in the news a little bit, but it's a little murky sometimes. You see it come up in newspapers and on the radio and on TV, but you may not know all that much about it unless you dig into it. So the Ford government, they're currently under fire right now for how they've managed the Skills Development Fund. So what that fund is supposed to do is, put forward funding for organizations that are offering innovative, and they do specify innovative projects, not just any projects, but innovative projects that help with hiring, training, or retraining workers in Ontario. This is meant as sort of response to the economic times we're in, and it's supposed to be about helping workers, not about helping businesses or donors or the government. It is supposed to be helping Ontario workers. So the Auditor General of Ontario, Shelley Spence, she came out with a report that called this $2.5 billion fund not fair, transparent, or accountable. Now, in Auditor General speak, that's like swearing your head off, essentially, as we were just talking about. Like, that is not language that they use very often. So can you talk about, given your role as critic and following along this file, can you talk about some of the issues that she's found with this program so far?
Well, I mean, when we see that, it's like, whoa, that's right up, our alley and what I'm doing. And, it's a shocker that we hear that. And, at the same time, we're thinking, all right, we have got to, point this out and hope that the public catches on. Because as we know, Doug Ford is a very cunning leader. He's very popular right now. And this is possibly one of the, next to the Greenbelt, I'm calling it Greenbelt 2.0, one of the biggest scandals to hit his government. And we are doing everything we can to make this stick, to have people, pay attention and listen to what's going on. And it's difficult because you're talking about a government that is constantly, at this point right now, we're sitting in the legislature dropping legislation here and there, bills left, right, and center to divert away, right? Like, renters issues, et cetera. We'll talk about that. But the Skills Development Fund speaks to everything we're so concerned about with this government. And that is, it's not the Skills Development Fund itself. Okay, let's be clear. We really agree with the principle of, or the intent of the Skills Development Fund and creating jobs and workers and training. That is all well intended. It is the administration of this fund that is a critical problem. As you said, the Auditor General pointing out accountability, everything to do with it is not ethical. And what we have done in response, we've been back in the House for 3 weeks. Every single day, 4 days we sit each week. Every single day, we were hammering the government on the Skills Development Fund. Myself calling for Labour Minister David Piccini's resignation because of what has become apparent, and we have to credit amazing journalism by the trillium, for piece by piece, like a slow leak of issues coming up every day. Who got the money and who was the friend and the insider. So I called this a circular economy of donors giving money and the money going back to the donors for their special funds. The most recent being a strip club. But anyway, we could talk.
I want to pull back a little bit on that, because you have mentioned just then that you've only been sitting for 3 weeks. And I want to talk about the importance of that in this conversation, because you are an opposition MPP. Your job is to oppose, when appropriate, the government on the policies that it's putting forth. Really, really hard to do if you never get to see them because they're not sitting in the House with you. So you got elected back in February.
Yeah.
You sat for, I think, a little bit. It was maybe a few weeks.
And it was like 11 weeks or something like that. And then we were froze again in June.
Right.
And
so you got the whole summer away from the House, which, again, I hate when people say, MPPs are not working, the government's not working. You're very much working on other things in other places, speaking to people in your ridings. It's all very important. But that is a very long time away from the accountability of the House itself. And so the extension was even longer than that, because of course you didn't come back till after Thanksgiving. Normally you come back at the start of September. This was not until after Thanksgiving. So this is a really, really long time after our government is freshly elected to get basically no eyes on it. How important has it been for you to actually be in the House to do this critical work you're doing?
Well, yeah, they absolutely don't want to hear from us, right? So no, they don't want to bring us back in the House to criticize and to hold to account, right? Absolutely correct there. And it has been essential that we are there, especially with the various things that crop up with the Skills Development Fund, Bill 60, all these things that we have to have the open and the transparent discussion and debate on, so the public can read between the lines with all these bills. And look, it's not easy. And as a a rookie MPP, so to speak, it's a lot of work to see. And thank goodness we have the Caucus Services Bureau now that we have party status. Hooray, thank goodness. We've got the help of an amazing team. But there's so much going on here that we could go at for days. And, we're still wondering if we're going to rise. We're supposed to sit till December 11th. We're still wondering if he's, got to cut it short again, because we are not giving up. We're not going to stop the pressure, right? And that is our job, to keep the pressure up. So it's not in the Ford government's interest to have us there, but it's definitely in all of ours and the public's.
Well, and this is something that they've been doing since they did bring you back. You're brought back, but they're rushing bills through.
Yeah.
So they're quickly getting them passed. I think I saw one bill the other day didn't even go to committee, which is something I've never seen in all my time in government. I've been in minority government as well. I've never seen it happen. I've never seen it in big majorities. I've literally never seen this happen, which is, the people we elect to go to Queen's Park to review these decisions at committee, like yourself, that's the whole point. You get to sit in the House and people's question period, and we can talk about whether that's valuable use of anyone's time. But committees, when a lot of this stuff gets hashed out at the legislative level, and they are just bypassing that process at this point. And to your point, they're talking about, the House rising in December again. Who knows when it will sit again, because they keep changing the calendar. How difficult is it actually holding them to account with a lot of these levers actually being pulled away from you by this government?
Right. All we're doing is, working as fast as we can to get the debate up, get things ready and prepped. We also have private members bills that we're able to submit. You can do as many as you want, but you get one debate day. So my debate day is December 11th for my private members bill, and I'm still not sure if it's going to happen, right? So
right.
We're just, that's why it's so critical. And you ask how important question period is. It's essential, because that's the best time we can get. I know on CP24, we would carry question period live every day. And that has a lot of penetration in the market. It still does, CP24. Or they'll pick the clips and they'll put them on CTV News at 6 of what's going on. So it's so important that we make the most of question period and really, really highlight the key fall downs of this government, the key ethical missteps like the SDF, right? Like what happened with Bill 60 and the renters situation. So an essential tool where we can get up and pose those questions, let our constituents know that we're doing it, ensure it gets on the news. So we need that, because we can do all the work in the constituency that we want to do. And we're trying. We're doing a housing summit tonight, as a matter of fact, to talk about the issues. But you need penetration on so many different levels: television, newsletters, my social media, right? Party social media, as much as we possibly can, to fight against this tide of keeping us at bay.
The question period piece, we've seen how it's done federally with some parties where they use it as like an opportunity to grandstand and all those things. I haven't found that with your caucus or with the NDP. You are very much asking these questions so that they're actually out there, because, you mentioned the Trillium, which has incredible covers. They do incredible work, but it is paywalled. So for a lot of people, they actually don't see this content. You're one way that content sort of gets out. When I had Colin DeMello on a few months ago, and we were talking about how journalism has changed over this time. And it's very much, hey, you're showing up somewhere, putting your camera in front of yourself and reporting to yourself live. And that's the amount of support you have. So it's really, really hard to do in-depth investigations on other issues off the side of your desk, because you're doing it while you're hosting, writing, doing all kinds of different things as a journalist. So MPPs having a voice in the House is really important to draw some of that context out. And we have seen that with both yourselves in the Liberal caucus and the NDP, actually bringing up some of that reporting. And you were talking about, how there's a little dribble every day, because they are doing that investigative work behind the scenes. And getting access to some information, I think, as MPPs, maybe you can't, because you don't really have the same sources, right? Can you talk about that little difference? Because it is a difference that, journalists are doing stuff more on the QT in the background, whereas as an MPP, your job is really to sort of find out what you can and say it loudly.
Right. And you got to verify, though, the same way. So, and I applaud journalists like Colin, at Queen's Park, who are getting the dribbles and following up on it. And you've always got to, source at least 3 times over, right, for stories that you're going to report on. With us, it's the same story. We have to. And when you're talking about the Skills Development Fund and the work that we've gone to ourselves verify information that we've seen in the Trillium, and also just keep the lines of communication open and say, hey, let us know. And sometimes we get a little tip here or there that we'll follow up on as well. The point is, when we have this information, we have to do our very best to somehow ensure that the public is listening and cares about it. And it's kind of like when you're doing a news story and, oh, nobody's going to care about this. Let's sexy this news story up a bit. I hate to say it, but we might have done it a few times just to help, captivate people's interest. And that's not like we're pushing it, too far. I mean, we're talking about a strip joint, that some of the Skills Development Fund money went to a donor who owns an organization that is an adult entertainment place. That stuff sounds salacious but suddenly we've been talking about this for 3 weeks, and the strip bangle came up, and suddenly it's, front page news again. So
Right.
It really is about making the most of the information you have. And myself as an MPP as well, what can I do when there's only so many reporters there? There's only so many stories they can cover, to your point. What are the tools that I can use to get the word out on social media, which we know is huge now? Look at the popularity of this podcast and other methods of getting information out there. So when I started as the MPP for Toronto St. Paul's, first thing I did was hire a great comms assistant, Will Reed, and we have also other staffers like Emma Fortunato, who are making a difference, and young, great, vibrant, and pit bull staffers who really believe in the vision that I have as well, to create what I call, and they support the St. Paul's News Network. And on the St. Paul's News Network, and our logo is the street.
With it, by the way, I love St. Paul's News Network. You did a video when the house had risen where you were hanging out a window at Queen's Park, and I was laughing my ass off because it was so funny, and it's such a fun approach to it. But also, you take a serious approach to it as well when necessary. And I think leaning on your journalistic background is really cool and fun, and I think it's just an interesting way to differentiate, because a lot of this is, talking head MPPs, and it's maybe not that interesting, but I think you found an interesting way to sort of break through, which is important when people need to hear these stories.
Right. And I want people to know that they can trust what I'm telling them. This isn't just for the show and just to, take down a government, which we would love, but it is actually factually based information that we really want to help get engagement on, for people to realize what's happening. We know with Doug Ford, you see the polls, you see the popularity, and we all wonder what's going to cut through, what is going to, grab people's attention to realize that, hey, folks, the cheese is slipping off the cracker, or hey, folks, don't poop on the beach. Like, that is just this folksy, really appealing part of Doug Ford that people love. And for whatever reason, they can't look beyond. So what we're hoping to do is cut through with factual information that's there all the time. And that's like being in the House day after day, or even issues in the riding. Like we had, you might remember back in the summer, there was the St. Clair Bridge that was closed because there was a homeless encampment under the bridge between Mount Pleasant and Yonge Street that caught fire. And that led to the destabilization of that bridge and the integrity of the bridge. So they had to close it down. That brought up, hey, St. Paul's News Network on the case. We went and shot underneath the bridge to look at the damage. We just went up and I spoke there about the issue with homelessness, right? And that's where we can highlight, this issue is a critical issue that can affect everything in our lives and in the city and the livelihoods of people, and it needs to be tackled. And then you hold the Ford government to account on the missteps when it comes to that homeless and housing file. So it's taking a huge page from the journalism book, using it to our advantage, and every day just getting up there and saying, this is what's not happening, this is what's not happening, and hopefully sooner or later it'll cut through with persistence and trusting that we are there as that trusted voice in the opposition.
So I want to talk about what that sort of looks like on the ground. So we have been talking about with the Skills Development Fund, how it has been a dribble, how there's been these little stories that have come out and caught more fire. For the uninitiated, can you talk a little bit more about some of those examples? Because this is a case where there's a Labor minister basically picking and choosing which projects get approved. There is a full rubric that he's supposed to be following, but we have found, according to the report from the Auditor General and what we've seen since then, that essentially he has picked lower scoring options, despite the fact that they haven't met the thresholds that they should be meeting to get this money in the first place, because of his relationships with donors who are behind those projects. So can you talk about some of those pieces? Because it's not so much just that projects are being awarded. I think part of why Ford gets away with things is, I saw on Twitter today, somebody was like, oh, construction, the thing that came out yesterday, Colin DeMello again was reporting on, was that LIUNA was specifically called out by the Labor minister as the organization that was going to build the tunnel under the 401. Now, there isn't even a feasibility study for this project yet. There has been no RFP process. There has been no proper weighing of bids, which, we've seen in other places in this government with, Ontario Place and other instances of this type of approach. So it's not, but I think they get away with it because they say, oh, well, yeah, construction workers are going to build this construction project. It's like, that's not the issue here.
Well, we want this too. Don't forget. We want to cut the red tape.
We want people to have jobs. We want people to do these projects. What we don't want is the minister to decide which exact firm is going to get that in advance because of who he's friends with. That's where the issue is. So can you talk about some of these things that have come up?
So I don't know if you saw our so-called murder board that we didn't call a murder board, but somebody else did. We created this.
I did. I loved it.
And there's nothing like a visual to help people see exactly what's going on. And we were talking about it like, oh, this friend gave to that friend and that kid. And like, we need something to visualize. So Puccini's in the middle of our so-called murder board and he's biting his nails like this. And then you see the twine go out to all the donors and kind of, okay, they gave this much, then that went back into this. And so and you nailed it, that with the Skills Development Fund, they are awarding contracts to organizations that got low score. Okay, tell us what your criteria is. What is the criteria? Just let us know, Minister, in question period every day. We are doing this. We are doing this for the workers. We have this, we're creating jobs. You don't want to create jobs. No. We didn't ask that question. Just answer the question. What is your ranking? How did you come to this determination that this person, this organization gets our hard-earned tax dollars? Never got any answers. So we had to go to the Integrity Commissioner. And that's when I filed, I have asked the Integrity Commissioner to investigate whether Minister Puccini, the Labour Minister David Puccini, violated the Members' Integrity Act or breached parliamentary ethics in the handling of $2.5 billion in the Skills Development Fund. So that's gone to the Integrity Commissioner. That's how deep we believe this goes, that it needs further examination, more than just the government being able to say, we have decided this and it shall be because we are in power and we can make this happen. But we're like, hold on. If we are seeing an established method of the circular economy with donors, friends, getting our taxpayer dollars to help their organizations, when others may be fully qualified being left behind, that is a huge problem. So that has formally been asked of with the Integrity Commissioner, and we are eagerly awaiting, the next steps.
It's a familiar bit of gaslighting from this government, because we saw this with Greenbelt as well, right? They first said those conversations didn't happen. Well, they did happen, but it's okay because there's nothing wrong with what happened. And then eventually we'll get to the point where Ford will be apologizing and say, oh, shucks, you know what? You were right. That's not how we should do it. He'll mosey on his way and continue to do things the same way. This is what we've seen throughout this process. So one of the things that your colleague John Fraser has brought forward is the fact that they keep pointing to all these jobs, and something that's been bothering me is they keep talking about all the women that are being hired. I'm like, can you stop using my gender for your
the dancers, and not saying anything wrong with hiring.
We want women hired, including in the trades. This is something I worked on when I was at Advanced Skills and Education. That was something we worked on, the apprenticeship strategy and getting more women involved. That's very important work. This is not the way to do it. But something that John has brought up is the forensic audit of the missing jobs data, because this is another part. You keep talking about these women that they're hiring, but they can't point to any jobs data about who has been hired, where, when, how long, etc. Can you talk a little bit about that?
It's just so frustrating. And it's like, we don't know anything. It's all under this cloak. It's been done by gosh, golly, or my gosh, it's done. And folks, we're doing everything we can. And we are helping, jobs. And again, it's not the fund, it's the administration of it and the transparency of it, which is absolutely absent. So this is the only way we feel we can get any answers. And, the audit's a perfect example. But at the end of the day, we have to ensure that the Integrity Commissioner comes back and either, confirms what we see or ensures that the books get opened up. But Teresa, we have asked for Minister Puccini's resignation time after time after time, and it's just not happened. And then we had this week recess now because it's DIT week. It's like, we are getting great momentum, but when we come back, the fight continues.
So I want to talk about the minister because, a couple of years ago, I was reading a glowing piece on him in the Narwhal, of all places, actually, I think it was, about him being environment minister at the time and how he's this young guy who's really serious about the files he takes on and yada, yada, yada. Not seeing a lot of evidence of that in this performance at all, but the minister has sort of been the lightning rod so far. And as you mentioned, you've called for his resignation. A lot of people are calling for his resignation because this just seems like he's not actually focused on the job he should be focused on. He's focused more on lining the pockets of the party that he runs for. So whether that's true or not is for, the Integrity Commissioner to figure out. But that's the feeling that people get right now in the public, so much so that the polling is now reflecting that. So when Abacus Data put out a poll at the end of October, these were the numbers. So 43% of Ontarians had heard about the controversy around the Skills Development Fund. And when asked if the minister should resign, 52% of Ontarians said yes. That's a whopping number. Usually 52% of Ontarians either aren't paying attention or don't care about any given issue that much. But in this case, a majority are saying, are saying he's got to go. 33% said they weren't sure. And then only 15% said he should stay on as minister, which is an atrocious number in terms of confidence in a minister of the crown doing their job and dealing with budgets of, 2.5 million here, billion here, et cetera, et cetera. Having said all that, though, it really does become a question of whether that will actually achieve anything, because as we know, this is more of a government-wide approach to contracts and the buddy system with donors. So when they polled about the scandal and asking if it was the fault of Pacini or if this was just a reflective of the entire Ford government itself, 46% agreed with the statement. And this is a quote: "There is a broader problem with the Ford government and how it awards contracts and grants." So do you think firing the minister will actually change anything, or is this something where the blame should really lie with the premier and how he manages government, across the board?
No matter what, the firing of that minister would be a destabilization of this government. Absolutely. We also know that the premier likely would never resign unless, let's wait, we're waiting on an RCMP investigation, right? But definitely a destabilization with Minister Pacini. And if those numbers hold, and that's great to hear, but then we just keep moving on. Next ministry, next ministry, next ministry. What's going on here? What's going on there? It's just the start. So this would be the first real, I would say, severe blow to this government. And it would show that there's a crack. And where there's a crack, there's wiggle room for us.
I thought for a second you were going to do a Leonard Cohen quote there.
Oh, no, sorry. Sorry to disappoint. That's my new quote. Where's there's a crack, there's wiggle room.
So on that, though, I love your optimism, but as somebody who used to work on the housing file, I remember when they ditched a housing minister over the Greenbelt stuff. And I've seen other ministers come and go through this government on other scandals. I've seen some stay, like on the Ontario Place file, but in a lot of cases, they have done some shuffles. And what has stayed constant is that the premier himself is Teflon. He apologizes, he does his aw shucks thing, he shuffles a guy here or there, and then everybody sort of moves on from the issue. Even with, an RCMP investigation still hanging over his head, we don't know when that will come to fruition. And something I've been thinking about, in the aftermath of this past campaign, especially in the last few months, as somebody who used to do fundraising for the party, I think about donation limits all the time. And
yeah,
it really concerns me that all of this conversation is happening about this fund and the relationships between this government and their donors. And yet at the same time, we're seeing new policies put forward where Ford is both saying he will call an election at any time he chooses, and that donation limits are going up to $5,000 per person per year. And it's a massive increase in the amount of donations that are being allowed. It's functionally a return to, the McGuinty era donation limits. It's almost the same amount of money. And so we're now in a place where he's creating the circular economy that you're talking about with donors. And he feels so emboldened and so shielded from any responsibility for any of the things he has done that he's putting forward these new policies that will actually make it really so much easier to actually raise money in this way. What do you think about that in terms of, the likelihood that this is actually going to impact him? Because it feels like he's, I don't want to say it this way, but he's kind of giving you guys in the opposition a fuck you in terms of you are not going to be able to do anything with us on this because we feel so confident that this method works for us that we are going to both be able to keep raising money this way and get away with it on election day.
We know nowadays that the public doesn't really trust politicians, right? We see that in the States especially. And I think that might be a reason why people turn away from watching closely. That's one theory. And then if they do watch, and get engaged for a minute, it's because something's happened that Ford's been able to present on television that's that's folksy and fun and like pouring out the Crown Royal, like, here I'm doing this, but meanwhile over there they're doing that. So what the bites that people do see, they connect with, and they like that. So it's really hard to break through on the likability factor with Doug Ford, but we can continue to work on the competency factor. That's what we've got. That's what really matters. And that's the messaging that we've got to continue to hammer home on every file that we see. And look, whether it's extending the donations, we talked about that, the limits, whether it's extending the time, election timelines, we have to just continue to highlight. And one day, we have to have faith that something will cut through, like the Skills Development Fund, and it will be a beginning. And maybe I'm going to continually be optimistic, because that's my job. And I think that, down the road, we're seeing what's going on here, and we hope that starts to spread, right? We can only keep working on it. It's getting to the truth. It's getting to accountability. It's getting to all those things, and trust. And you can trust us to work on the truth for the people of Ontario, right? And that's how we have to just keep fighting.
The thought I've always had about it is, you'll know from your time in journalism that when a politician weaves the way, if you want to use the Trump word, weaves the way that Ford does, or, puts things in the window, that's a Steve Bannon term, about just filling the window with a whole bunch of distracting things so that you can never really latch on any one scandal. And it's something Trump has, done really well with. I think it's something he learned from the Fords when he came to Canada and talked to both of them back in those days. People forget about that linkage, but he did learn this from them. But it's something that he does really well. And I think the way to fight it, people get obsessed with like the strip club story and stuff like that, but that doesn't really tie it enough back to what matters. And I think that's the main piece that the opposition parties have to remember, which is unemployed Ontarians. So, we have this fund that is supposed to be helping them, and there's all this focus on the donors and stuff, which is important, accountability, ethical thing. But at the same time, who is not getting a job in this time? So,
right, the schools are falling apart. The jobs aren't
exactly
there, right? And we're saying this continuously. The worst unemployment in the country, in Ontario. And this is not, if that's not cutting through. I mean, look, the autism file, you've got, education, you have healthcare. Still, 2.5 million people don't have a family doctor. Still, and this is about a government that's looking after their insiders and friends, and the rest of us be damned. Look at Bill 60, taking power away from renters. Right? It's an omnibus bill with all kinds of ominous things, but ominously omnibus. But there's so many things. So yes, we are talking about ethics, integrity, transparency, and accountability with SDF, with the Skills Development Fund. But this is just, there's so many other things that we're also talking about. And our critics are doing that, right, with the Liberal critics. So and the pressure is staying on, but Ontarians are suffering.
Exactly. And I think the advice I've always given to people is, okay, focus on the ethics stuff, but then you need to be able to talk about why that matters in people's real lives. So you mentioned the jobs numbers. I was there. I graduated into the Great Recession, which was a really great time to graduate into and become part of the workforce. We've had, the pandemic lockdown era, which had a big impact on jobs as well. But the current economy, you can talk about Trump, but there's also been 7 years of Doug Ford economic policy now that was supposed to be about opening up the province for business. And we just have not seen a strong economy come out of this guy who said that's what he was going to be all about. In fact, over 700,000 people in this province are now without a job. And I always like to give people a visual. That's like firing the entire city of Hamilton, everyone who lives in Hamilton. That's an enormous number. That is something not to be proud of. And they keep harping on about the jobs they're creating in this program. And people are not feeling it on the ground. People are really struggling. People who do have jobs work multiple jobs, or they work jobs with not enough income to cover the basics. So people are really, really struggling out there. And in all this kerfuffle about, what Pacini and Ford are doing with this fund and who they're, supporting through this fund, who they're getting donations from, that's what gets lost in this story, is all the people who are hurting, who they are not helping, who they are not seeing, who they are not prioritizing. So almost a third of those people who are out of work right now have been out of work for more than 6 months. That's not a temporary problem. That is a long-term problem that hurts not only those people and their families, but also our broader economy. Then there's the fact that nearly 1 in 5 young people now cannot find work. And, we can talk about AI, we can talk about Trump, but there are a lot of forces working against young people now, even getting into the workforce. And how do you build a career if you can't get in the first place? So it's basically the worst jobs market we've seen outside of the Great Recession and the pandemic in this century, in this province. What needs to happen to turn around the Skills Development Fund into, a more transparent and useful tool that actually helps people get work in this province?
Watching the jobs numbers, you got to help the employers, right? You got to cut the employee or the small business taxes. You got to do all kinds of, which the government refuses to do. And that means you can hire people, right? You get a break to hire more. I'll never forget, in the summer, we thought, let's have a job fair in Toronto St. Paul's this riding. And we were really excited about it. And then we went and talked to some experts in the area in the riding. And they said, well, actually don't bother, because there are no jobs. These employers can't hire. They're barely staying alive. The employers. So we know that this is a crisis when you can't even, okay, we'll hold a resume fair then to help you, or hold a volunteer fair so that maybe if they get lucky and they're able to, make some money in this economy, they'll be able to hire down the road and they'll think of you because you volunteered for them. Like, that was pretty sad. And, we know that in the decline in, we had a little bit of a decline in October in our unemployment, but the number of unemployed workers is still poised to increase for a third consecutive year in 2025. And that decline, is actually, Ontario is the worst of the largest provinces in Canada when it comes to unemployment. So we have to do whatever we can, whether it's the break on the small business tax, break on anything, and which was part of our platform too, and the government, we called in to do that, not doing it. So anything we can to get those jobs back. And the youth unemployment is just scary, right? And we actually have opposition day on Monday. So our oppo motion is all about jobs for youth. And so we're going to be unveiling that on Monday.
Anecdote is not data, but I was walking down the street in our riding, and I tucked into one of those just corner shops to get, I don't know, chips or something like that. And unprovoked in any kind of way, the guy behind the cash, who was a young guy, probably in his very early 20s, he asked me, "Can I ask you a question?" And I said, "Sure." I don't know what about me looked like I had any useful information to impart to him that day, but he's like, "I'm graduating and I just don't know how to get a job. I've been reaching out to everywhere. I've been having conversations with people. I've been putting my resume everywhere. I just don't know what I'm doing wrong." And it was really difficult because I've graduated into that environment. Yeah. And I knew that the answer was, there's not a lot you can do because it's really bad out there. And that's really tough message to send to younger people, when the message is supposed to be to younger people, you're going to have better than the generation before you. And that is simply not happening. And it's so bad, it's so pronounced that, young people today are literally asking strangers off the street, how can I get ahead, because it's not working out for me. I think that is a really rough environment. And I just don't see this government doing anything on that front. You're talking about small businesses too. They employ most of the workers, a majority of the workers. I think it's 64% of workers in this province. They're 92% of businesses in this province, and they're getting zero support. Your caucus has put forward motions to get them support in terms of tax breaks. This government has not responded at all. So again, it is about these big organizations getting special treatment through these economic funds that are not actually based on any kind of data, that are not producing any data, and that we can't seem to see who they're hiring at all. It's just a terrible recipe, and I just don't know how they're getting away with it.
And what we're calling for is like a targeted jobs program. Targeted, accountable, transparent. Just think of all those dollars. And I know there was a lot of debate about the $75 million spent on those ads by the Ford government, right, in the US. Put the debate aside on Oh, by the way, 10% increase in tariffs allegedly going to come, says the president. We'll see. But imagine what could have been done with that $75 million. Or even how many of the millions of the skills development fund properly allocated, right, into education, into jobs. That's the thing that is, it's just, how do they not see this is what I don't understand. And sure, there might have been a tick in October jobs numbers a little bit, a lot, you know what, also attributed to part-time work and the Blue Jays, actually.
Yeah.
So,
well, and you always see that, as a former retail worker, you always see that ebb start to come up in October as we're heading into the holiday season. So this
right?
is just something that happens.
So it's not real. It's sadly, it's a tick, but it's not the end. That's why we're so, coming back with that push, with that motion for a real targeted jobs program, because, without jobs, and it's devastating, right? And then you have the whole housing sector as well with renting. And oh my gosh, we haven't even talked about, renting and the fear that
that'll be another episode when we have you on for that. I did want to ask you one sort of somewhat out of left field question, because you were around as a journalist at the time.
Mm-hmm.
This entire conversation about the Skills Development Fund, to me, it strikes me as being very similar to the sponsorship scandal. It's something that's happening later in a government's term. It's something that's happening with, working with donors, money going out without any real checks and balances. But what people forget about the sponsorship scandal is that amount of money was much smaller than this amount of money that we're talking about. So when you talk about the scale of it and how that ended up bringing down, a dynastic government and led to, 10 years of conservative rule at the federal level, and led to also a lot of accountability changes brought in by the Harper government. That was, again, part of why they got elected in 2006. Mm-hmm. Do you see any parallels there? Because I'm seeing a lot of them, and I was a pretty young person at that time, maybe not that, knowledgeable about it.
Yeah. Well, you wonder if they get a little bit too comfortable, right? And they just carry on, and they've got 80 seats in the House. Sorry, I should say 79 seats in the House now. Right. Now 2 independents, 2 Greens, and 14 of us, and the rest NDP. So they feel like we can do what we want. We are Teflon, and, accountability doesn't matter, and we can keep handing out and nobody's paying attention. Right. And there's that arrogance there. And what we're trying to say is we are always here watching that money, watching the taxpayer dollars, accountability, integrity, ethics. That will always be part of our platform going forward, which we're going to be building more and more as we go into the next chapter for the Ontario Liberals. But it's like we're not taking our eyes off, and that's why I'm so honored to have the position, the critic position that I do, because it seems like there's absolutely everything that's tabled can fall into that category, one element or another, right? And so we just keep on keeping on and hope for that whole competency piece of the government to just we just shine a light on it continuously and work as much as we can to ensure that the SDF, when we hear back from the Integrity Commissioner, it's going to be very interesting. When we hear back on the Greenbelt, it's going to be very interesting. So we eagerly await that.
I did note, as you were very easily counting off the members of House in each party, that you are very obviously a whip. You had those numbers ready to go. I did want to talk about strengthening ethics going forward. So, as you mentioned, this is something that the party will likely look at going into the next. Well, I hope they will look at going into the next election. There's no permanent leader right now. There's going to be a leadership race coming up. We don't know when any of these things are happening yet. Hopefully, we'll have some dates before the end of the year. But, I've always argued that when the moment comes, we're going to need a government as a party, a government ethics and accountability package to make a pitch to voters that we are different. Because I think what people see is they go, well, that's just government. That's how politicians behave. Right, and they paint everybody with the same brush. No. Exactly. So you need, in order to actually convince people you're different, it can't be just pointing out what the other side is doing, because I think they kind of brush that off as just, oh, sour grapes, you're saying that because it's the opponent that you have over there. But I think you actually have to put something in the window. And from a strategic standpoint, I think it'd be a really helpful thing to do to put forward a bit of a package of ideas
Mhm.
so that every time Ford does something bad afterwards, you can go, well, we're going to solve that with this. Anyways, let's talk about healthcare and how he's failing you on that front. I really do think that's an important pivot to be able to make. And that's why you need that package really upfront in the discussions of the next platform. But based on your work as the critic and seeing all the scandals that you're seeing firsthand, front row, what do you think should be in the foundation of such a plan going forward? Because I think it's very clear from this government that we do need some ethics reform going forward.
Funny you should ask. I've been thinking about that. You know what? And it's, you've got to strengthen the independent oversight, right? You've got to strengthen that as much as you can. You empower officers of the legislature and you reinforce the conflict of interest laws. So they're front and center in absolute rules in everything that you do. And you work to modernize transparency laws, and that's through real-time disclosure of the lobbying that's going on, which would be really interesting. And then also with procurement, donations alongside stronger freedom of information standards, right? And then embedding a culture of integrity across all government, like through things like ethics training and opening up the data process. So it's all about transparency and specifics. And I know when we start to talk about going forward with the party, this is going to be a key element, because it's a key element with this government that is necessary, as we can see with the behaviors that we've seen. We're documenting as we go, just since this government started sitting, after the Feb 27th election.
Let's have a little bit more fun, because these are heavy topics about misuse spending and people not being treated properly and all that kind of stuff. But you're wrapping up your first year, not full year, but technical calendar year in office. And I just kind of want to know, what do you enjoy the most about being an MPP so far? Because you seem like you're having a ton of fun. And what are you looking forward to in the new year as you sort of get to that 1 year mark?
I love the fact that it is like everything I've done. It's like my whole life was meant to do this. Because when I work with people in the community, in the constituency office, it's like you're doing interviews every day. You're diagnosing issues. You're talking to people about what matters, what's impacting their day-to-day lives. And let me tell you, in Toronto St. Paul's, it's been an incredible awakening for the issues that impact this riding that you said is so diverse. And I might say we have about 68% of the riding is renters. And there is a real crisis out there, affordability crisis and crisis for the people of Toronto St. Paul. So that's become abundantly clear. I love the fact that I have a way to advocate, to use whatever tools I have to advocate for the issues in this riding. I feel that is such an incredible honor for me. I'll never forget the day that I went in and saw my seat in the legislature for the first time. And the weight of it is on you when you can talk about politicians, and I understand that they can get a really bad name, but the second I was elected, I felt the enormity of it. And then seeing that you have a seat in this legislature where you can do the work for the people that got you there, that never leaves me day after day. And that's why hearing the stories, it just makes me that much stronger to want to advocate and do all that I can. And it's a true joy for me, and it's a true honor. And then to think of the tools that I can do it with, because I don't mind, like it's not good that we're opposition, but it empowers me in a lot of ways to work harder and stronger and come up with more innovative ways to cut through and to do my job for the people of Toronto St. Paul's. And did I imagine I'd be here one day? Absolutely not. But am I just incredibly thrilled and honored and grateful. And for the young team that I have working with me, I'm so glad they're so young and smart, because they know so much that I don't know. And I feel that that's a huge piece of my success too, and will be going forward.
Well, I think that is a fantastic note to end on. We're going to have you on again, obviously, at some point in the new year. So looking forward to that. But thanks again for coming on.
My pleasure. And you're a constituent, so you have to come and see me. Anything you need. Take care. Thank you.
You've been listening to Progress Canada, presented by Lightbulb Narrative, a Canadian-owned company specializing in strategic communications, narrative development, and content creation. Our music today was composed by Elliot Middleton. If you enjoyed today's episode, please consider subscribing to access future episodes the moment they drop. Thanks for listening.